Aliens tortured an innocent alien girl until one human stepped forward without fear. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. The winds howled, carrying the biting cold across the barren wasteland of planet Zythar, a desolate world far from Earth. The ground was covered in thick layers of frost, and the sky above was an ominous gray. In the heart of the alien city, a scene unfolded that was far from what anyone could imagine. A young alien girl, with delicate violet skin, was bound to a cold stone pillar in the middle of the square. Her hands were shackled, and her head hung low in defeat. She was innocent, an innocent alien girl who had never caused harm to anyone. Yet here she was, enduring the cruel punishment of beings who were supposed to protect her. The crowd of onlookers gathered, their eyes cold and indifferent. They saw her as nothing more than a scapegoat, someone to make an example of. Her crime was nothing but a misunderstanding, a mistake she could never take back. As the alien guards laughed and mocked her, the girl's heart sank. But despite the pain and fear, she refused to cry. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her broken. Then, from the crowd, a figure stepped forward. His presence was calm, yet undeniable. James Turner, a human ex-soldier from Earth, had found himself on this forsaken planet by chance. He had been hired as a bodyguard for a diplomat, but when he saw the young girl in distress, something inside him stirred. He couldn't just stand by. He was no hero, no savior, but he could not ignore the injustice he saw before him. The alien guards turned their attention to James, sneering at his presence. "What are you doing here, human?" one of them asked with a mocking tone. James didn't flinch. He didn't respond with words, but with actions. He moved closer to the girl, his eyes fixed on the guards. The alien captain barked an order, but James was already there, standing tall and unafraid. The moment felt suspended in time, the crowd waiting, the guards preparing to strike, and the girl holding her breath. But James had made his decision. With a single move, he reached for his weapon. Not to fight, but to protect. The guards hesitated, unsure of what to do with a human who wasn't intimidated by them. James turned to the girl, offering a reassuring nod. "You're not alone," he said quietly. His voice was steady, calm. The alien girl looked up at him, her violet eyes filled with confusion and hope. For the first time since her capture, she felt a spark of something other than fear. Hope. She wasn't sure who this human was, or why he cared, but in that moment, she understood something about humanity. In a galaxy full of indifference and cruelty, there was still someone who would step forward without fear, someone who would fight for what was right. James didn't wait for the guards to make their move. He knew the time for talk was over. His actions spoke louder than any words could. The alien guards took a step back, clearly unsure of how to deal with someone who wasn't afraid of them. The young girl was still in chains, but for the first time, she felt like someone cared. And that made all the difference. James stood tall in front of the alien guards, his eyes never leaving their cold, unforgiving faces. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with the expectation of violence. But James did not back down. He knew that, in this moment, his presence was the only thing standing between the young alien girl and the cruelty that had been forced upon her. The girl's chains clinked softly as she shifted, her violet eyes locked on him, searching for a sign of reassurance. James didn't offer her false promises. He simply gave her a nod, as if to say, "You're not alone anymore." The alien captain, his sharp features twisted into a sneer, took a step forward, his soldiers flanking him. "You have no business here, human," the captain growled, his voice low and threatening. James didn't flinch. He could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him, but he stood firm. Asterisk if this is how it has to be, asterisk he thought, then so be it. The crowd that had gathered around them watched in eerie silence, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and indifference. James could sense the weight of their gazes, but his focus was entirely on the girl in front of him. She was still shackled to the stone pillar, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Hope? Determination? It was hard to say, But whatever it was enough to make James feel like he had made the right decision. "Let her go," James said, his voice calm but firm. The captain snorted, clearly amused by the human's audacity. "And why would I do that?" he asked, his grin widening. "She's nothing more than a prisoner, a tool to be used. Your kind are naive to think otherwise." James stood silent for a moment, weighing his next words carefully. He could feel the pressure mounting, but he knew that this was the moment when everything would change. "Because she's not your tool," James said, his voice steady. "And she's not anyone's prisoner. She's a person, and I'm not leaving here without her." The captain's amusement faded, replaced by a dangerous glint in his eyes. He motioned to his guards, signaling them to move in closer. James knew the situation could escalate quickly, but he wasn't afraid. The girl deserved to be free, and he wasn't going to let anyone stop him. As the guards advanced, James stepped forward, positioning himself between them and the girl. He wasn't armed. He hadn't expected to be, but his body language alone conveyed that he wasn't afraid. The alien soldiers hesitated, uncertain of how to proceed. James wasn't the kind of human they were used to dealing with. He wasn't a pawn to be controlled, nor was he a warrior in the traditional sense. But he was something they hadn't counted on, a man with the courage to stand up for what was right. The captain snarled and made a move to strike, but before he could, one of his own soldiers raised a hand to stop him. "Captain," the soldier said hesitantly, "he's not backing down." The captain glared at James, his fists clenched in frustration. "Then we'll see how long he lasts," he muttered. But instead of attacking, he gave a sharp nod to his men. "We'll give you one chance, human," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Leave now, or we'll make sure you regret it." James's response was simple. He didn't move an inch. The standoff lingered in the air, the tension thick and heavy. But James knew that if he faltered now, everything he had done up to this point would be for nothing. Slowly, the captain and his guards backed away, their eyes still filled with contempt, but there was a reluctance in their movements. James had won, not through violence, but through sheer willpower. The girl, still shackled but now free from immediate threat, looked at James with a mix of confusion and gratitude. Her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "Why?" she asked, her eyes searching his face. James looked at her, his expression softening. "Because everyone deserves to be free," he said quietly, his words simple but carrying the weight of everything that had led him here. The girl didn't respond immediately, but her expression softened, a tear slipping down her cheek. It wasn't the relief of escape. It was the realization that someone had seen her as more than just a prisoner. Someone had believed in her worth. In that moment, James understood the power of compassion. In a world filled with cruelty, it was the small, quiet acts of kindness that could change everything. And that was all he needed to know. James stood still, watching as the alien guards hesitated. For a brief moment, there was a sense of disbelief in the air. The captain, who had once looked at James with nothing but contempt, was now uncertain. He could see that this human was different from the others. James had not fought with weapons or force, but with courage and a deep sense of righteousness. The captain's eyes flickered between his soldiers, then back to James. He had expected to deal with a frightened, submissive human, but this one was resolute, unmoved. James didn't back down, and the weight of his quiet strength was enough to make the captain pause. The air was thick with tension, but James knew that for the first time in his life, he wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for someone else, for a stranger who had been wronged. The guards, who had once been so certain of their power over the innocent alien girl, now found themselves at a crossroads. They had seen many humans before, but none like James. The girl, still standing in the center of the square, had watched the entire exchange, her violet eyes wide with awe and confusion. She couldn't understand why this human cared, why he was willing to risk his life for her. She had been conditioned to believe that her worth was defined by her ability to serve, to be useful to others. But James was different. He didn't see her as a tool or a means to an end. He saw her as a person, a fellow being who deserved respect and freedom. The crowd, once murmuring with curiosity and indifference, began to quiet down. The tension in the square was palpable. James could feel the weight of their eyes on him, but he focused only on the girl in front of him. Slowly, cautiously, he stepped toward her. With each step, He could feel the weight of history, the weight of all the wrongs that had been done to her and to others like her. But with every step, his resolve only grew stronger. When he finally reached her, he placed a hand on the chains that bound her, carefully but firmly. "It's over," he said quietly, looking her in the eyes. "You're free now." The girl didn't speak, but her eyes softened. For the first time, she wasn't alone. For the first time, someone had chosen to fight for her. Someone had chosen to see her as a person. And that meant everything. The alien guards, realizing that their grip on the situation was slipping, began to retreat. James didn't need to look back at them. He knew they wouldn't challenge him now. The captain, once so certain of his superiority, looked at James with something new in his eyes, respect, or perhaps fear. But whatever it was enough to make him step back. James turned to the girl, his hand still gently resting on the chains. "Let's get you out of here," he said. She nodded slowly, the weight of the moment sinking in. She had been freed, not just from her chains, but from the belief that she was nothing more than a prisoner, a tool for someone else's gain. James had given her something far more valuable than freedom. He had given her the belief that she mattered, that she was worthy of respect. As they began to walk away from the square, the crowd parted, watching them with a mix of disbelief and awe. James and the girl, two beings from different worlds, had just proven that even in the face of injustice, a single act of courage could change everything. James and the girl walked through the deserted streets, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the silence. The chaos from the square was behind them, but the weight of what had just transpired lingered in the air. James couldn't help but glance at her every now and then, his mind racing with questions. Who was she? Why had she been treated this way? She had remained silent since they left the square, her hands still bound by the chains, but there was a look in her eyes that spoke volumes. It was a mix of gratitude, confusion, and something deeper, something James couldn't quite place. "Are you okay?" James asked gently, breaking the silence. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, she didn't say anything. She was still processing everything that had just happened. Then, slowly, she nodded. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice soft but steady. "Thank you." James didn't respond right away. His mind was still reeling from the strange sense of camaraderie he felt with her. Despite their differences, despite the vast distance between their worlds, they had shared something powerful. In that brief moment, they had connected on a level that transcended species. It wasn't just about saving her. It was about showing her that she mattered, that she was more than what others had made her believe. As they continued walking, James noticed how the alien city seemed different now. The towering spires, the strange, shimmering lights, the endless rows of buildings. All of it felt foreign, almost hostile. He had never imagined he would find himself in a place like this, fighting not for his own survival, but for someone else's. The girl glanced up at him, her eyes filled with curiosity. "You're not like the others," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. James turned to her, surprised by the question. "What do you mean?" he asked. "The others, the ones who treated me like I was nothing," she explained, her voice trailing off. "They saw me as just a tool, something to use. But you—" She paused, as if searching for the right words. "You saw me as a person." James felt a lump form in his throat. He hadn't expected her to understand so clearly, to recognize what had driven him to act. "Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity," he said quietly. "No one should be made to feel like they don't matter." The girl looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "I don't know what to say," she finally whispered. "I've never had anyone stand up for me like that before." The words hit James harder than he expected. He had acted on instinct, driven by the knowledge that no one deserved to suffer, that no one should be left to endure cruelty alone. But hearing her say that, he realized just how deep the impact of his actions was. He wasn't just helping her escape. He was helping her reclaim her sense of worth. The girl glanced around as they walked, the unfamiliar city streets stretching out before them. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice filled with uncertainty. James had no clear answer. He wasn't sure what came next, but he knew he couldn't just leave her to fend for herself. "We'll find somewhere safe," he said, his voice firm with determination. "Somewhere you can start over." They walked in silence for a few more minutes, the weight of the moment still hanging in the air. As they rounded a corner, James spotted a small building ahead, a quiet, unassuming structure tucked away from the rest of the city. It looked like a safe place, somewhere they could regroup, think, and plan their next move. James turned to the girl, offering her a reassuring smile. "We're going to be okay," he said, though part of him wasn't entirely sure. But in that moment, he realized that he wasn't alone. He wasn't just a man trying to survive in an alien world. He was a person with a purpose, and that purpose was to help someone who needed it. Together, they could figure out what came next, step by step. The building was quieter than James had anticipated. It was small, tucked away in a forgotten corner of the city, its walls adorned with alien symbols that James couldn't make sense of. Yet, for all its alien features, it felt more like a home than the cold, imposing structures surrounding it. He led the girl inside, keeping a careful eye on their surroundings. There was no telling who might be looking for them after the scene in the square. The girl stepped inside hesitantly, her eyes scanning the room as she took in her surroundings. The air was stale, but not uncomfortable. It smelled faintly of metal and old fabric, and a small, dim light flickered from the ceiling. James made his way to a corner of the room where a small table and 2 chairs sat. He motioned for the girl to sit. She did, though her movements were slow, cautious. As she settled into the chair, she glanced at James, her violet eyes searching his face. "What now?" she asked, her voice quiet, almost unsure. James took a seat across from her, his mind racing. He had no clear plan. He had done what he could to get her out of immediate danger, but now what? They were both stuck in a city full of strangers, and James had no idea who to trust. "We'll figure it out," he said, trying to reassure her. "I'm not leaving you, and I'll make sure you're safe." The girl nodded slowly, her expression softening slightly. She still hadn't said much, but James could see the wheels turning in her head. He didn't want to push her, but he couldn't help wondering what was going on in her mind. The chains that had bound her in the square were still wrapped around her wrists, though she had not spoken of it. She had kept them on as if she wasn't quite ready to let go of the past. "What's your name?" James asked, breaking the silence. The girl looked at him, her expression unreadable for a moment, before she responded softly. "Zyra." The name sounded unfamiliar to James, but he smiled anyway, offering a small nod. "Zyra," he repeated, testing the sound of it. "It's a beautiful name." Zyra didn't respond immediately. She merely looked down at her hands, her fingers tracing the edges of the chains that still bound her. James noticed this, his heart tightening. "We'll get those off soon," he said quietly, his voice soft but firm. "You don't need to carry that weight anymore." Zyra looked up at him then, her eyes full of gratitude, but also something else, something James couldn't quite place. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James met her gaze, feeling the weight of her question. He had asked himself the same thing many times in the past few hours. He had never expected his life to take this turn. He had come to this planet for a job, a simple job, but now everything had changed. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said, his voice steady. "Because you matter, Zyra. You deserve better than what they've done to you." Zyra's expression softened, but there was still a sadness in her eyes. "I don't even know what better looks like," she admitted. James felt a pang of sympathy for her. She had been raised in a world where her worth had been defined by her usefulness, her ability to serve. She had never been taught to see herself as something more. "Better is whatever you choose it to be," James said gently. "You're free now. You can make your own path." Zyra didn't respond, but her gaze lingered on James, as if she were trying to understand him. James couldn't help but feel that they were on the cusp of something important, something that would change both of their lives forever. But for now, they were safe, together in this quiet, hidden space, away from the chaos of the city. And that was enough, at least for the moment. The door to the small room creaked open, and James turned quickly, his hand instinctively reaching for the weapon at his side. But it was just a soft, familiar voice that spoke. "Are you two okay?" It was a voice James didn't recognize, but it was calm and reassuring, not threatening. He relaxed his grip, slowly. Zyra had turned to look at the door, and for the first time since they had arrived, there was a flicker of hope in her eyes. The door creaked open wider, and the soft voice grew louder as a figure stepped into the dim light of the room. James tensed for a moment, his instincts still on high alert, but the voice, calm and soothing, put him at ease. The figure was a tall, alien woman, her skin a deep shade of blue, with long silver hair cascading around her shoulders. She had an air of authority but also warmth, something unexpected for someone who clearly held power in this city. "Are you two okay?" she asked again, her eyes scanning James and Zyra with a mix of curiosity and concern. James studied her for a moment, unsure of what to make of her, but the fact that she didn't feel threatening was enough for him to relax. Zyra's eyes widened as she took in the newcomer, her mouth slightly agape. She had not expected anyone to find them so quickly, especially not someone who seemed so calm and composed in a city where danger seemed to lurk around every corner. James was the first to respond, his voice steady but cautious. "We're fine, thank you," he said, still unsure of her intentions. The woman smiled slightly, her expression softening. "My name is Lyra," she said, stepping further into the room. "I've been following your movements for some time now. I had a feeling you would need assistance." James looked at Zyra, who remained quiet but appeared both intrigued and confused by the sudden appearance of Lyra. He could tell she didn't know what to make of the situation either. "Assistance?" James echoed, narrowing his eyes. "We don't need anything from you. We're fine on our own." Lyra nodded understandingly, but did not seem offended. "I understand your hesitation," she replied. "But you're in a dangerous place. You might not have realized it, but you're being hunted. The ones who had Zyra locked up in the square, they won't stop looking for you until they have her back." James' heart sank. The gravity of their situation was hitting him all at once. He had known there would be consequences for freeing Zyra, but hearing it from someone else made it feel all the more real. "Why are you helping us?" James asked, his voice steady but filled with suspicion. "What's your interest in this?" Lyra took a step closer to him, her eyes locking with his. "My interest is simple," she said softly, her tone sincere. "Zyra is one of my people. I know what they did to her, and I won't stand by and watch it happen again. I've been trying to protect her for a long time." Zyra's eyes widened at this revelation, and she looked at Lyra with a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "You've been trying to protect me?" she asked, her voice trembling. Lyra nodded. "Yes," she replied gently. "You were never meant to be treated the way they treated you. You are more than just a pawn in their game." James could feel the weight of Lyra's words as she spoke, her calm demeanor belying the depth of her intentions. It was clear that she was not like the others, the ones who had imprisoned Zyra and used her for their own gain. Lyra was different. She was someone who saw Zyra for who she truly was, someone who believed in her worth. "We need to get out of here," Lyra continued, her voice low but urgent. "They'll be coming for you soon, and it won't be long before they realize you're not alone." James nodded, his mind working quickly. He had no time to waste. "Where do we go?" he asked, looking at Lyra with determination. "I'll take you to a safe place," she said, her voice firm with confidence. "But we need to move quickly." Zyra stood up slowly, the chains still rattling as she moved. James noticed her hesitation. It was as if she wasn't sure whether to trust Lyra, but something in her expression changed as she looked at the alien woman. There was a flicker of hope in her eyes, something James hadn't seen in her since they first met. "Let's go," James said, turning toward the door. Lyra stepped aside, gesturing for them to follow her. As they walked out into the quiet hall, James couldn't help but feel the weight of what they were about to do. They were in a city that wasn't theirs, surrounded by enemies. But for the first time since this all started, James felt like they might actually have a chance. With Lyra's help, they might be able to escape, to start a new life. And for Zyra, that was all that mattered. The possibility of freedom, of a future where she wasn't treated as an object, was within reach. James felt a sense of responsibility, not just to protect her, but to give her the life she deserved. They had to keep moving, and fast, but for the first time, he wasn't just running for his own life. He was running for hers too. James, Lyra, and Zyra moved through the narrow corridors of the hidden building, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpets that lined the floor. The air was tense, every sound amplified in the quiet. The walls, adorned with strange alien symbols, seemed to close in around them, but Lyra moved with the ease of someone who had lived in this city for much longer than James had. She led them through winding hallways, occasionally pausing to listen for any sounds of pursuit. James, ever alert, kept a close eye on their surroundings. The city was alive with danger, and it wouldn't take long for their escape to be noticed. Zyra walked beside him, her movements slower than usual, the weight of her chains still dragging her down. James could see the uncertainty in her eyes. She had been treated like nothing more than an object for so long that it was hard for her to comprehend that she was free. But James could feel her slowly beginning to trust him, just a little more with each passing moment. "We're almost there," Lyra whispered, her voice barely audible. "Just a few more turns, and we'll be out of sight." James nodded, his hand never leaving the handle of the weapon at his side. The sounds of the city outside felt distant, muffled, as if they were in a world of their own. Every moment that passed without incident was a small victory, but James knew that their luck couldn't hold forever. "Lyra," James said quietly, keeping his voice low, "why are you really helping us?" Lyra glanced back at him, her silver eyes catching the dim light. There was a brief pause before she answered. "Because Zyra deserves a chance," she said simply. "I've seen what they do to people like her. I've seen the way they treat those they deem disposable. I can't stand by and watch that anymore." Her words were honest, filled with conviction, and James found himself trusting her more with each passing second. She was no ordinary stranger offering help. She was someone who had seen the same cruelty Zyra had faced and refused to let it continue. "And what about you?" James asked, his curiosity getting the better of him. "What's your stake in all of this?" Lyra hesitated for a moment, her gaze focused ahead. "I'm not just anyone," she said, her voice soft but tinged with a deep sadness. "I was once part of their system. I've lived under their rule, just like Zyra. But I made a choice. I couldn't keep living that way, knowing what I was helping to do." James processed her words carefully. "You're an ally," he said, more to himself than to her. Lyra smiled faintly. "I am now." They continued down the hallway, the sound of their footsteps blending into the background as they reached a heavy door at the end of the hall. Lyra motioned for them to stop. She pressed her hand against the wall, and a hidden panel slid open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. "This way," Lyra instructed. James and Zyra followed her inside, and the door closed softly behind them. The room was small but comfortable, with a few basic furnishings scattered around. There was a bed in the corner, a table with some basic equipment, and a window that looked out over the city, though the view was obscured by thick curtains. "We'll stay here for a while," Lyra said, her voice calm and reassuring. "It's not much, but it's safe. For now." James took a deep breath, looking at the two women beside him. Zyra had finally relaxed, her posture less rigid as she sat on the bed, still rubbing her wrists where the chains had been. "Thank you," Zyra said quietly, her voice soft but sincere. "For everything." Lyra nodded, a slight smile tugging at her lips. "You're welcome," she said, her tone gentle. "Now we wait. We need to give the city some time to calm down before we make our next move." James sat down across from Zyra, keeping a watchful eye on the door. He knew the city was full of people who would do anything to find her, to reclaim her. But for now, they were safe, hidden away from the chaos that had consumed them. And that was enough. "You're free now, Zyra," James said softly, his words carrying a weight of their own. "You don't have to be afraid anymore." Zyra looked at him, her eyes filled with emotion. She had lived in fear for so long that the idea of a future without it was almost too much to comprehend. But she was beginning to believe him. She was starting to believe that freedom was something worth fighting for. And that, for the first time, there was hope. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. James looked at her, a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Now we live," he said simply. "And we make sure nothing like this ever happens again." James sat across from Zyra in the small room, the weight of the silence pressing down on him. He could hear the faint hum of the city outside, but inside, it felt like they were in a world of their own, cut off from everything that had happened. Zyra sat with her legs pulled close to her chest, her eyes lost in thought as she stared out the window. James noticed the way her hands fidgeted, as if she were still unsure of what to do with her freedom. She had been through so much, and the idea of starting over, of truly being free, was likely overwhelming. "I've never felt like this before," Zyra said softly, her voice barely a whisper. James turned to her, concern flickering in his eyes. "Like what?" he asked, his tone gentle. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she looked down at her hands, then back out the window, her face a mask of contemplation. "I've spent so long trying to survive," she continued. "Just trying to get by, to do what I was told. But now Now I don't know what to do. I've never had the chance to think for myself. James understood more than she knew. He had lived a life where survival was the primary concern, where every day was a fight, just to make it through. But for him, the fight had always been for something worth fighting for. For Zaira, it had been different. She had never had the luxury of fighting for herself. You don't have to figure everything out right now, James said, his voice calm. Take your time. We're here, and we're safe for now. Zaira nodded slowly, but the uncertainty in her eyes remained. She had been locked in a cage of expectations and fear for so long that the idea of freedom was foreign to her. The city outside, with all its alien architecture and unfamiliar sounds, felt like a different world. It was a world where she was free, but it was also one where she had no idea how to navigate. What do we do now? She asked, looking back at him. James leaned back, his arms crossed over his chest. He didn't have all the answers, but he had an idea of what they needed to do. We figure it out, he said simply. Together. But first, we need to lay low for a while. Let things cool off. Once we're sure it's safe, we'll plan our next move. Zaira seemed to relax a little, as if the weight of her uncertainty had lifted just a fraction. She nodded again, this time more confidently. Together, she repeated, as if testing the word on her tongue. James smiled faintly. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. Yeah, together, he agreed. They sat in silence for a while, the quiet only broken by the occasional sound from the street outside. James could feel the tension in the room slowly dissipating, as if the walls themselves were exhaling. They were safe, for now, and that was enough. As the hours passed, Zaira seemed to relax more, her earlier tension easing as she adjusted to the newfound sense of security. James, however, remained vigilant. He knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. The moment the authorities realized Zaira was gone, they would come looking. But for the first time, James felt a sense of peace. It wasn't much, but it was something. And as long as they had that, they had a chance. Zaira eventually stood up, stretching her limbs and looking around the small room. It's strange, she said, her voice thoughtful. I never imagined this kind of life. James looked at her, his gaze steady. It's a strange life, all right, he said. But it's yours now. Zaira smiled just a little. It was small, but it was enough to make James believe that maybe, just maybe, they could make it. Together, they could figure out how to move forward in this strange, new world. And for Zaira, that was the beginning of something she never thought possible, hope. The two of them sat there for the rest of the evening, talking quietly, making plans for the future. James knew it wouldn't be easy, but he also knew that with Zaira by his side, they had a chance. And that was all he needed to keep going. The next few days passed quietly, but the tension was never far from James' mind. He kept his eyes on the horizon, always aware of the danger that could arrive at any moment. Lyra had left them in the safe house, promising to return with supplies and information. For now, it was just James and Zaira. The space they occupied felt small, but for the first time in a long while, it felt like a haven. Zaira was adjusting, bit by bit. She no longer fidgeted nervously. Her hands had stopped worrying at the chains, and her eyes, though still wary, were starting to shine with something else, hope. She had asked a few questions about Earth, about what life was like there, and James did his best to explain. The simple things, the food, the seasons, the vast landscapes that stretched beyond what she had ever seen, seemed to intrigue her. She had never experienced freedom, so the idea of it was still foreign. But in her quiet moments, when she sat by the window and watched the light of the alien city flicker outside, James could see the transformation in her. She was starting to believe in something bigger than survival. One evening, as they sat together, Zaira turned to him, her expression thoughtful. James, she began slowly, as if testing the words in her mind first. How did you become like this? James raised an eyebrow, unsure of what she meant. Like what? The way you are, she said, her voice gentle but curious. You're not afraid. You do what's right, no matter the cost. James smiled faintly, the weight of her words sinking in. He hadn't thought about it that way before. I guess I just got tired of running, he said after a moment, his voice soft, but tinged with the truth of his past. I spent a long time just trying to survive. But surviving isn't enough. I realized that if I wanted to live with myself, I had to stand up for what I believe in. I had to make a choice, even if it was hard. Zyra looked at him, her violet eyes wide, as if processing everything he said. There was a long silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. I think I understand, she said quietly. I used to just exist, doing what I was told. But I never had the chance to choose. You're choosing now, James said, his voice firm, but kind. Zyra nodded slowly, her gaze dropping to her hands. It feels strange, she admitted. I don't know if I'm ready. I don't know what to do with this freedom. James placed a hand on the table between them, the quiet gesture meant to reassure. You don't have to have all the answers right now. It's okay to take it slow. The important thing is that you're free to choose. And you have time to figure out what that means. Zyra looked up at him, her expression softer than it had been since he met her. Thank you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You're welcome, James replied, his voice steady. It was quiet for a while longer, both of them lost in thought, the weight of their words hanging in the air. Outside, the city continued its relentless hum, but in the small room, it felt like time had slowed. They were safe, for now. The next day, Lyra returned with the supplies and news. She explained that the authorities had begun searching in earnest, combing through the city for any trace of Zyra. But they had no idea where she was. We have a few more days, Lyra said, her expression serious. But we need to move soon. James nodded. He had expected this, but it didn't make it any easier. Zyra, who had been listening quietly, stood up, her hands still slightly trembling, though she tried to hide it. Where will we go? She asked, her voice filled with a mix of fear and uncertainty. Lyra looked at her with a calm, reassuring gaze. We'll get you to a place where no one can find you. A safe place, she said. James turned to Zyra, offering her a reassuring smile. We'll be okay. Just one more step. Zyra looked at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of doubt. She found none. For the first time since they had met, she allowed herself to trust fully. Okay, she said, her voice steady. Let's go. Together, with Lyra leading the way, they moved forward, not knowing what the future held, but with the belief that they were taking control of their own destinies. It was a small victory, but it was theirs, and it was enough for now.